Hello, and thank you once again for coming along to Eco Views and News. Today we're going to want to look at vulnerability, community vulnerability, nation-state vulnerability, human vulnerability, in all of its aspects to the emerging changes in climate that we're all beginning to experience. This, you might think, is happening elsewhere in the world and not in your neck of the woods, but don't worry. This is a global phenomena, and it will catch up with all parts of the world very quickly. We're not immune to it, certainly here in the Western world, and in fact, we've already started experiencing some of the extreme weather. But to begin with, obviously, the most vulnerable countries have been those on islands that are closest to sea level and subject to rather abrupt shifts in one way or another to extreme weather events and to the secular trend of rising sea levels. This is going to be quite a dramatic case study, and we've seen it already, in a sense, presented by the public media in one way or another. We have ample evidence now that extreme weather is becoming more and more frequent and devastating for greater numbers of the human community all over the world. And for that reason, you can follow it now through EcoJustice TV. You should recognize our solidarity with most of the other parts of the world where extreme weather is beginning to register first and have some very devastating impacts.
Typhoon Haiyan, a storm for the record books.
We knew this was going to get pretty big.
Drawing power from ocean and air, it becomes a savage monster, nearly 300 miles across.
Winds of 195 miles per hour, gusts up to 240. Right now, it's as mean as a cyclone can actually get on this planet.
This actually went off the scale. It was a monster storm.
On November 8th, 2013, it becomes what could be the most powerful typhoon in history to make landfall.
The storm peaked right as it was going ashore in the Philippines. That's the tragedy.
Haiyan brings terrifying winds, torrential rain, and a deadly high-speed flood.
20-foot storm surge came almost instantaneously, like a tsunami. The devastation underneath this storm is unlike anything else we've seen underneath the tropical system before.
In its terrible aftermath, thousands of lives lost.
We did not expect that there will be a flood that will be coming.
So many died because of the water. Neighbors, families by families.
Almost immediately, the questions begin.
Why so much casualty with this typhoon? Even our own weather center underestimated the surge.
Could the deadly flood, the storm surge, have been predicted and catastrophe averted?
We really have a long way to go with storm surge modeling. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go.
Is Haiyan a sign of things to come? The first of a new breed of super typhoon.
Are we loading the deck towards more intense storms in the future as we provide a warmer base of ocean water for these storms to tap into?
What could happen if the next killer storm strikes closer to home?
If that storm had hit the southeastern U.S., it was so powerful, it would have been as much a disaster.
The race is on to understand the killer typhoon right now on Nova.
Okay, now here you get Nova doing a program on the killer typhoon. Don't let the ironies escape you here. Nova is often brought to you by the very people who are making money selling more and more fossil fuels. This is really quite extraordinary. If you look through the credits and let it run for a while, sometimes you'll get a sense of this.
Explosive storms that bring torrential rain, flooding, and screaming winds. Typhoon is the term given to hurricanes that form in the northwestern Pacific Ocean.
Hurricanes and typhoons are some of the most massive storms on the planet. And we see very strong typhoons in the Western Pacific, more commonly than people may think.
Here among the tropical islands north of Australia are some of the warmest waters on the planet. Fertile breeding ground for monster storms. By late October 2013, this region has already produced 14 typhoons. And now, unlucky number 15 begins to form. A killer whose name will soon become synonymous with devastation and heartbreaking loss.
Well, you can trace this yourself right off of the website, ecojustice.tv. Watch the full hour documentary. Watch as well who it's brought to you by. Among others, it's David H. Koch of the Koch brothers, famous for intervening to prevent any effective action on limiting carbon emissions. It's quite an amazing piece of irony that the storm information we're getting now, in retrospect, happening somewhere else in the world, is actually being funded by some of the money that is derived from selling more and more fossil fuels. Well, we don't have to go to the Philippines to see what's going on. You need look only as far as Sandy to see superstorms. They're not quite on the scale of the typhoons of the Pacific, but they're large enough and quite scary.
A superstorm.
It really was the worst that nature delivers in storms.
It's the most famous city in the world.
8.5 million people. What could possibly go wrong?
And leaves devastation.
I'm thinking, how many homes are we going to lose? How many people are we going to lose?
Using scientific analysis.
The forecast was done as best as it could, but it still underestimated the scale of the storm surge.
The men who run New York.
This is worse than my worst fear. The water from the Hudson River was flowing down into the Battery Tunnel.
10 networks went simultaneously.
An eyewitness testimony.
They all just exploded from the wind like a bomb went off.
I see that wave coming around the corner every night when I go to sleep, and it's just not a good feeling.
This film plots the critical moments of an assault by one of nature's most powerful storms on one of the most sophisticated cities in the world.
There's no system that's bulletproof. There's no system that is impenetrable.
New York, one of the most famous cities in the world. 8.2 million people crowded into just 321 square miles. A giant metropolis underpinned by a complex and crowded network of essential services. None more important than the city's 108-year-old subway system.
The New York City subway system is quite unique. It works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. New Yorkers are used to being able to go down into the subway system and be able to get a train any time of the day or night, any holiday, whenever, and they expect it to happen.
Often using the same tunnels as the subway, electrical power is delivered to the city's inhabitants by one of the most sophisticated networks of power grids in the world. In 6 days' time, New York, the city that never sleeps, will be plunged into darkness.
We haven't had shortages of electricity. We've not had rolling blackouts. So basically, we've been able to keep up with the demand of the city. What our customers want is to turn the switch and for the lights to go on.
New York's entire infrastructure, petrol stations, cash machines, transportation and power, normally running 24/7, is about to face the onslaught of the biggest Atlantic hurricane in history. About 1,500 miles to the southeast in the Caribbean Sea, a hurricane is forming. In 5 days' time, it will write itself into New York's history books.
Hurricanes are systems that are born in the tropics, and they need to have 26 degrees Celsius approximately 80 degrees Fahrenheit water to get the systems going.
Air heated by the ocean rises up into the sky. This moist ocean air forms huge clouds. Air rushes in to fill the void, and a cycle of circulation from bottom to top and back begins. This huge volume of circulating air is sitting above the rotating Earth. Air accelerates towards the low-pressure center of the storm and interacts with the spin of the Earth, causing the winds to turn anti-clockwise. This is the birth of a hurricane.
Okay, and once again you can see the full documentary from the website. I won't play it here because you have time to look at it in detail. What you need to know very quickly, though, is that what's happening in the tropics in terms of extreme weather and changes in degrees at the ocean surface very quickly, within 5 days, can hit the most densely populated and vulnerable of infrastructures in the cities along the coast. New York is not quite like other cities in the sense that most of its infrastructure is underground. And so close to water, it means that it's underwater very quickly if any of the barriers are breached to the underwater system. Not as bad in a snowstorm. Why? Well, it's simple. Snow falls, you can shovel it, and they do in New York, with big earth lifters, and dump it in the back of a truck and drive it out of the city or dump it into the ocean on the piers. You can get rid of the surface water into the surrounding waters if it's a snowstorm by taking the snow away. But if it's not snow, if it's water, you've got other problems. It then becomes part of the slosh on both sides of the island, and you have to face the storm surge coming in from the Atlantic itself. This means that all of your infrastructure, everything that flows through the area in terms of electricity, money, transactions, water itself, all of that is compromised very quickly. And this is what we learned from the circumstance around Sandy. Hurricane Sandy documentary, take a look at it, the particular case here. It caused the mayor to focus on the whole question of what do we need to do? And he came back with an extraordinary plan.
It is a battle that our administration has been waging as aggressively as any city in the world. In fact, I think it's fair to say that Plan YC is the most ambitious sustainability program any city has ever undertaken. It's incredibly ambitious, and much of the work will extend far beyond the next 203 days that we have in our administration.
Now look what's going on here. Up over his shoulder is an indication of Plan YC. Basically, it's the plan for New York City for what to do from now on in reference to these extreme weather events. Well, what's he got in mind?
We refuse to pass responsibility for creating a plan on to the next administration. This is urgent work, and it must begin now. In fact, we expect that by mid-century, up to a quarter of all New York City's land area, where 800,000 residents live today, will be in the floodplain.
Now that's pretty extraordinary. Sitting in a city of 8 million people, saying that 1/4 he expects by mid-century to be within the floodplain and vulnerable to these extreme weather events. Well, you've got to do something by way of preparing for these kinds of things. Not just one storm after another, but for girding up against the vulnerabilities and developing a plan for preparedness.
And they could have prevented a lot of the flooding that we saw during Sandy. And that's especially true of what's called backdoor flooding, when water overflows rivers, creeks, and canals. So today we're proposing that several surge barriers be considered to shut those back doors. We'll also work with the Army Corps of Engineers to ensure that a strong system of permanent levees, flood walls, and other protective measures gets built along the east shore of Staten Island from Fort Wadsworth to Tottenville, including Midland Beach.
Now, these are the plans for hardening the defenses, right? But you've got to do a whole lot more, and his report recognizes that as well. In fact, he goes on to give an extraordinary report, especially looking at the vulnerability of the underground aspects of the built environment. Take a look. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the vulnerability of the city.
Superstorm Sandy struck. More than 70 people were killed along the eastern seaboard. Damage totaled more than $65 billion, and it pounded New Jersey and New York City hard. It also prompted a re-examination about how to prepare for future disasters. The NewsHour science correspondent Miles O'Brien has the first of two reports for us, this on changes in New York.
Hurricane Sandy brought mighty Gotham to its knees. And 1 year later, the people who keep this city running are scrambling to figure out how to keep it dry as storms worsen and the sea level rises. The Consolidated Edison power substation that sits at the end of 14th Street, right next to the East River, is about 6 feet above sea level.
The water and electricity does not mix, obviously.
Most of the electricity for Lower Manhattan flows through these transformers and relays, as long as they're not underwater. For over 50 years, the 11-foot-high flood walls worked just fine, until Sandy's storm surge pushed 14 feet of water over the banks of the East River.
Okay, you can see the problem. You've got a strategy to harden infrastructure, but then you've got infrastructure that's very vulnerable right behind whatever barriers you try to put up. And you're never going to be able to put them up fast enough to anticipate, in effect, what's coming in terms of extreme weather events on top of the secular trend of rising seas. Now, this places not only New York, but every other coastal city in a very vulnerable position. I'd urge you to get a copy. You can get it from the website, ecojustice.tv site, of this Plan YC. Take a look at a stronger, more resilient New York is the title of it. It's an 80-page report, can give you a lot of information and serve as a model for how we ought to start to think about things around here in Boston. A great deal of Boston would have been underwater if Sandy had given it a direct hit. Charles River Dam would probably have been overtopped with anything like a Category 3 or higher hurricane is projected, and this is what would be flooded, including all of MIT, the Back Bay, Boston University, and a good deal of Harvard, as well as parts of Charleston and Chelsea and others. I mean, it's just extraordinary. In response to that, the former mayor, Menino, commissioned a study, and in fact, it's now come out. It's called Preparing for a Rising Tide, and this is the report itself. Take a look at it. It's written by Ellen Douglas, Paul Kirshen, Vivian Lee of the Boston Harbor Association, Chris Watson, and Julie Warner. This is really, in fact, a very important document to get a hold of. Again, you can get it off the website and see what's being thought about in Boston. It's not just Boston, but in fact the whole Northeast that has to start thinking about these things, in part because extreme weather just doesn't confine itself to the coastal areas. As we saw this month, in fact, within the last month, there was an extreme weather event that hit large parts of Maine, crippling it for days. So much so that the BBC carried the report, because it was both in Canada and the United States that there were impacts.
The snow on the ground, the blue sky. But we've got a problem. We haven't had power since Saturday, since that massive ice storm swept up from North America through Ontario and here into Quebec. So that means we've got no power, we've got no running water, we've got no heat. We're having to melt snow on the barbecue outside to give us water, and it's minus 15 outside, pretty cold in the house as well. We've got a big roaring log fire going. But here's the problem. Look at this tree. Every single tree looks like this. Beautiful icicles forming, but they're cracking and falling onto the power lines. No one.
Okay, now the BBC is recording this happening in Canada, the northern United States, where think we're used to these things, but when they come with such severity and frequency that the power can be wiped out and you have no heat, no water, and no electricity for up to 10 days in the cases in southern Maine, you've got major public health problems. You've got major issues with disruption of business and schools, everyday life, basically, on all fronts. You get 2 of those storms in a month, and the whole month is gone. This is the kind of thing that whole communities are beginning to ask, well, how can we move beyond, in a sense, the event-by-event circumstance and start looking at broader questions? Yes, we've got crisis events and emergency response, and we're pretty good at that. And more crisis events, sometimes 2 in a month, and we'll get emergency response. Well, let's tool it up. We can tool up our emergency response, but we're not getting at the bigger issue. And this is what the change in thinking represents now, moving to a different scale of planning and foresight. We're looking at vulnerability and preparedness analysis. Beyond the emergency response, what kind of analysis should be done on a larger scale for vulnerability and preparedness? This is what Mayor Bloomberg did in New York and what Tom Menino did here in Boston, to look at vulnerability and preparedness analysis. And that's become a whole new realm of thinking and planning. It's hardening itself, developing into academic expertise, and people getting up and saying this ought to be done on a regular basis, not just occasionally, but we ought to develop curricula so that people can address this in the schooling they get, both in high school and up through colleges, and then, of course, the advanced graduate work. Beyond vulnerability and preparedness, we're looking towards resilience and adaptation. That is, how can you make whole regions, like the northeast part of the United States, resilient, and how can we encourage strategies of adaptation? This gets into planning. So we were moving from a response to analysis to longer-term planning. And that, too, is something that needs to be taken on. This is what's starting to emerge as what's being called transition studies. What is it a transition toward? Well, it's a transition towards a new climate regime, which we don't have the ability to predict in detail. We can see that we need to be much more responsive to extreme emergency events, but it's not just one emergency after another. It's this question of analyzing the longer-term vulnerability, developing preparedness strategies, and then moving towards forward thinking about how we can build in resilience and adaptation planning to the city planning process, to the zoning process, to the development process in every one of the cities and towns that face this. These are why these are being called transition studies. It's a transition from the fossil-fueled world towards what? Well, towards a post-fossil fueled world. If we don't make a planned transition, we're going to be slammed into the transition in a very tragic way. We urge you to keep in touch with this as we keep going in the Cambridge climate research tradition here of looking beyond the storm itself to the afterstorm, and beyond the afterstorm to the forward planning, get beyond severe events, as it were. Cambridge Climate Research Associates is working on this with several educational institutions to promote climate science for human survival, because the public deserves to know, while there's still time to act. The more time that goes by without acting, the more difficulty there's going to be, and more expense is going to be involved in acting retrospectively. Keep in touch on air and online with what's emerging here. You can get access to any one of these stories and trends through EcoJustice TV. Thank you very much for joining us this week. See you next week.